thank you for coming out on such a rainy night to hear what I think you will enjoy. It's a wonderful lecture. The Dibner Library of the History of Science and Technology, for those of you who don't know, is located over in the National Museum of American History. And it's one of what I can say now are 3 rare book facilities, which join the other 17 of our libraries that make up the Smithsonian Institution Libraries Network. The 3rd one being a brand new rare book vault in the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York, where we have a library and where they are about to open a brand new facility and show it off tomorrow morning. Well, since 1992, the Dibner Library Lectures featured a distinguished scholar who has made a significant contribution to his or her field of study, which must relate in some way to the Dibner Library's holdings. Now, the speakers may be chosen based on a recently published and successful book, or well-received lectures, or perhaps an entire scholarly output in the subjects of history of science and technology. Many have published and many of these lectures have been published and freely distributed, and some have been video archived, and we are going to video the lecture tonight, and so at the end, if there are questions, I just want to alert you that it may be recorded. Topics have covered astrophysics and astronomy, history of architecture, medicine, chemistry, bookmaking, and history of the book. We've looked at the pencil, the way the Earth's diameter was measured, the American Victorian house, magic and technology, and the printing press. Today's lecturer will join a distinguished group of scholars from such places as Harvard, Northwestern, Princeton, the U.S. Naval Observatory, University of Virginia, and many others who've shared with us their passion for their subjects. Bernd Dibner, the distinguished collector for whom the Dibner Library is named, always wanted his collections to be used and appreciated by scholars and researchers. He was himself self-taught in these matters, but through his publications and collecting, he became well known in the history of science and technology. His book, Heralds of Science, which describes the 200 major works from the 15th century to Watson and Crick's discovery of DNA that he thought were the most important works of science, is often cited by book dealers as part of their description of books for sale in their catalogs. They'll say Heralds of Science, number 24. These lectures have been funded by the Dibner family to honor Bernd's memory, first through the Dibner Fund and its president, Bernd's son David, and his wife Frances, and now carried on by Bernd's grandsons, Brent, Daniel, and Mark. We so appreciate their support, and I know that you'll enjoy the latest lecture in this series. I'm now happy to introduce the Smithsonian Library's head of special collections, Lila Vekerdi. Lila's office is in the Dibner Library, and she's surrounded by images of Bernd, but more important, she's surrounded by the marvelous collection he left us. Lila will introduce our speaker. Lila?
Thank you, Nancy. And I want to thank you all also for coming out on this rainy day and being our audience for this wonderful lecture that we are going to hear. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, Laura Snyder. Laura J. Snyder is Associate Professor of Philosophy at St. John's University, Queens, New York, since September 2003. And she is author of the book, The Philosophical Breakfast Club. I quote, I'm not thinking of the rise and fall of empires, the change of dynasties, the establishment of governments. I am thinking of those revolutions of science which have had much more effect than any political causes, which have changed the position and prospects of mankind more than all the conquests and the codes and all the legislators that ever lived." End of quote. I borrowed this quotation by Benjamin Disraeli, 19th century British statesman, from Professor Snyder's book because this special affiliation with history manifested already early in her career as well. She earned her first BA degree in the history of Western thought at Brandeis University. Her second BA and her master's and doctoral degrees are all in philosophy, earned at Brandeis University and Johns Hopkins University, respectively. She specializes now in the history of philosophy of science, the history of science, and in intellectual history. Her additional research interests are epistemology and political philosophy, and she has teaching experience in metaphysics, ancient philosophy, and introductory logic. Professor Snyder has held visiting positions as well at the University of Pittsburgh, at the University of Chicago, at Cambridge University, and was Mellon Fellow in the Humanities at University of Pennsylvania. As we began organizing this lecture, I have been exchanging email messages with Dr. Snyder many a day. We joked that this was like the correspondence of the 19th century men of science who profusely used the opportunity that at that time there was mail service several times daily. The other fruitful way of scientific information exchange in the 19th century, as it is today, was publishing in professional journals and belonging to professional organizations. These functions determined Professor Snyder's career as well. Professional positions she has held include President of the International Society for the History of Philosophy of Science in 2009 and 2010, co-editor of the Journal of this society, and organizer of the second German-American Frontiers of the Humanities Conference in 2005. From the many fellowships and honors Dr. Snyder has received, let me just list a few. 2011 Divner Library Lecturer, Smithsonian Institution. Visiting Senior Fellow, Institute for Advanced Studies, University of Bologna. Summer Research Stipend, National Endowment of the Humanities. Fulbright Scholar Award. Elected Life Member, Clare Hall, Cambridge University. The latest publication by Professor Snyder, as I have mentioned, is the Philosophical Breakfast Club, 4 Remarkable Friends Who Transformed Science and Changed the World. The book was awarded a Scientific American Notable Book, a Selection of the Month by the Scientific American Book Club, and was the winner of the 2011 Royal Institution for Australia poll for favorite science book. It was also reviewed in numerous general press and scientific magazines, and very interestingly, was published in Italian translation just 2 months after its publication in the United States. Besides 2 more monographs, Professor Snyder is the author of numerous articles and book reviews as well. In addition, she was invited presenter at 7 meetings, gave 15 other conference papers, and 20 additional invited talks. The title of Dr. Snyder's lecture tonight is The Philosophical Breakfast Club and the Invention of the Scientist. Dr. Snyder.
Well, thank you, both Nancy Gwynn and Leela Vicardi, for such lovely introductions. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the Smithsonian Institution Libraries and the Dibner Family Fund for making this possible. I'm going to talk today about the Philosophical Breakfast Club. You can still hear me here, can you not? No? Do we need to fix that? It's okay? Not okay? Should I just raise my voice? Is that better? Okay, thank you. So the Philosophical Breakfast Club and the Invention of the Scientist. And I would like to start by setting a scene that occurred in a room much like this, I think a bit larger, but also a lovely room, the Senate House at the University of Cambridge in June 1833. They were holding the third meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and the room was filled with members who had traveled from throughout Britain, of course, but also from the continent and America to attend the meeting. And at this meeting, there was a confrontation between two men. One of them, S.T. Coleridge, the Romantic poet, who oddly enough turned up at this meeting in Cambridge, although he had not left his home in Highgate for quite some time before then. In 1817, not many people know this, but in 1817 he had published a work on scientific method, so he had a long-standing interest in the topics of this meeting. The other of the confronters was William Whewell, at that time a young don at Cambridge. He had recently retired as professor of mineralogy and had just published a work on the relation between science and religion. In a lull in the meeting, Coleridge stood up and he demanded that the members of the British Association stop calling themselves natural philosophers. As a real metaphysician, he said, I demand that you stop using that term for yourselves. Of course, people weren't too happy about this. They felt they were natural philosophers as much as Coleridge was. And you can imagine there was probably a din as people were complaining about this. Whewell, who was a very imposing man physically, and the host of the meeting, since he was basically, I guess, on the local organizing committee, Whewell then stood up and responded politely, agreeing with the distinguished gentleman that a satisfactory term was wanting for the members of the association. If philosophers, he said, is taken to be too wide and lofty a term, then by analogy with artist, we may form scientist. And this was, to our knowledge, the first time the word scientist was uttered in public ever, in 1833. Now, the fact that it was Whewell who first coined this term is interesting in a few ways. One is, it's consistent with his philosophical view, which is that new discoveries in science require new terminology to denote the new properties and entities being talked about. Right? And as he put it in one of his philosophical works, such a coinage of new terms has always taken place at the great epochs of discovery, like the metals that are struck at the beginning of a new reign. And in fact, Whewell became so well known for coining terms that the young Michael Faraday, only a few months after this meeting at Cambridge, sent Whewell a letter saying, I am in a trouble which, when it occurs at Cambridge, is, I understand, referred by everyone to you for removal. To which Whewell responded by giving him some terms that were taken up by Faraday, in particular anode, cathode, and ion. These are other words that Whewell invented. And he would later go on to invent terms for Charles Lyell, the geologist. So the invention of the scientist by Whewell is a sign that he believed a new epoch had arrived for the natural philosopher, that there was a reason why a new name was needed. It wasn't just that Coleridge had demanded a new term. Whewell agreed with him that it was time for a new name. And I'm going to argue in this talk today that he was right. A new epoch had arrived for the natural philosopher, although the complete transformation would still take decades more. And that transformation was from the amateur, the clergyman, the country squire, the industrialist, the factotum, Here, I see there are some behind me as well. There are some rather large and scary beetles. These are other beetles that Darwin was collecting while he was basically on his country estate. Industrialists like John Marshall would study chemistry to try to think of how to best bleach their fabric. Or people would be employed by wealthy men who liked to have literary companions, such as Joseph Priestley was for the Marquis of Lansdowne when he used this apparatus to discover oxygen. Right? So this is basically the status of the natural philosopher early in the 19th century. By the end of the century, you have the professional scientist who has a particular scientific method, professional societies that, generally speaking, he belonged to, and other hallmarks of modern scientific research. So that's the transformation that's taking place in the 19th century. And as I talk about in my book, and as I'm going to talk more about today, that all started about 20 years earlier. In 1812, four rather remarkable men met as students at Cambridge University. And they were Charles Babbage, who would go on to be the inventor of the first prototype of a computer. He was a brilliant mathematician, and he did many different things, but he's most known for that. John Herschel, the son of William Herschel, the astronomer. John Herschel also went on to make many interesting discoveries in astronomy. He was also a brilliant chemist, and as part of his chemical work, he turned out to be the co-inventor of photography, because he's the one who invented the way to stop the action of light on the silver nitrate paper. Basically, he enabled the fixing of photographs. William Whewell, we've already met. In addition to being the inventor of the word scientist, he engaged in many scientific pursuits. He was really the initiator of worldwide research projects. He organized research on the tides, where people in 28 different countries were doing observations of the action of the tides at the same time, so that he could compile all of that to make maps of the action of the tides across the oceans. Sorry about that. I'm a little out of practice. Richard Jones, the least well-known of the four, he was a political economist of note who was an early critic of David Ricardo's economic theory, which we will be hearing a little more about shortly. They met in 1812, and they very quickly realized they would become friends of a lifetime, as they called each other. Within months of meeting over the summer vacation, Charles Babbage and John Herschel were sending each other letters signed, "Yours till death shall stop my breath." This is one of those letters, and I'm glad this came out large enough that you can see John Herschel is scribbling a little cartoon here, which is entitled "Dionysius, the God of Functions," and that's their friend / foe, Dionysius Lardner, the science popularizer and publisher. Over the course of their lives, after they graduated from Cambridge, they sent each other hundreds and hundreds of letters. They visited each other whenever possible. They took trips on the continent together whenever England and France were no longer at war, those short periods of time. And their families were very much intertwined. Jones and Whewell were both godfathers to children of John Herschel. The two men who were clergymen of the four, Jones and William Whewell, performed weddings of the other ones. At one point later in life, Whewell performed the wedding ceremony of Herschel's daughter, Louisa, who is marrying Whewell's own nephew. So their family lives were very intertwined as well. We know that for a period of time, while they were all at Cambridge together, probably in the winter, spring of 1812, 1813, they were meeting for philosophical breakfasts. And we know that partly because in 1841, when Whewell was master of Trinity College, he received a letter from someone who had been invited to those meetings sometimes. And that person said to Whewell, "We have all made some advances in physical science, but in metaphysics, I am not conscious of having advanced one single step since the period when you and I and Herschel and Babbage used to meet at our Sunday morning's philosophical breakfasts. Whoops, that didn't work. They used to meet in St. John's, in the second court of St. John's, where Herschel had his rooms, and Jones in a later letter wrote to Herschel, "Do you remember us all sitting at St. John's with feet on your fireplace fender?" And even later, Babbage said to Jones that he recognized the fruit of the undergraduate confabulations of the good old set on every page of Jones's newly published work. We also know what they ate at these breakfasts, thanks to the Irish novelist Maria Edgeworth. During one of her tours of England, she went to Cambridge and she had breakfast in the rooms of a don there, and she recorded in a letter to her mother that we had tea, coffee, tongue, cold beef, exquisite breads, and many inches of butter. All the butter in Cambridge must be stretched into rolls an inch in diameter, and these are sold by inches, measured out by compasses in a truly mathematical manner. Apparently, the students ate even better, because a visiting American student who wrote his memoirs about the time he spent at Trinity College told someone that at their breakfasts in their rooms, they ate toast, muffins, crumpets, eggs, 2 inches each of butter, ham, cold chicken, beef steaks, audit ale, that is, they were drinking beer, tea and coffee, honey, marmalade, and anchovies with all the et ceteras. Though it is hard to think what the et ceteras could be after that long list of food. So they were having these breakfasts. They met Sunday mornings after the compulsory chapel service. They would eat all these wonderful foods. Also on the menu, some bacon. I couldn't really resist that one. Sir Francis Bacon, the 16th, 17th century philosopher and politician. These men would talk about his book, The Novum Organon. Whewell, later, when he wrote a book about Jones and their friends at Cambridge, he said the Novum Organon was one of their favorite subjects of discussion. In that work, Bacon had called for a sweeping scientific revolution, and in many ways, he helped bring about a scientific revolution in the period that we think of as the scientific revolution in the 17th century. People like Newton and Robert Boyle and William Harvey were influenced to some degree by Bacon's writings, which, were coming out as they were still living. But these men who were meeting for their philosophical breakfasts felt that science had stagnated since that time, and that there was a need for a new scientific revolution based on Baconian principles. What I will talk about in the rest of the time today is the way that the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club were influenced by 4 aspects of Bacon's call for a scientific revolution to bring about a new revolution in the 19th century. And the 4 aspects I'm going to talk about briefly: Bacon's call for an inductive, evidence-based scientific method, his idea that science should be for the good of the public, the idea that there should be new professional scientific societies, and also the idea that public funding for science should be available to help scientists, men of science, do their work. And starting with the idea of an inductive evidence-based method. In the time of Bacon, the medieval followers of Aristotle were arguing that deductive method was the way science should run. In Bacon's time and a little bit afterwards, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes was also similarly arguing that science, like math, like geometry, should start from self-evident truths or universal axioms and then deduce laws of nature from that. And deducing from a self-evident truth or universal axiom would get you knowledge that was certain rather than probable. So the most commonly known type of deductive reasoning is the syllogism, right? So the usual example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then it certainly follows with necessity that all men are mortal. You don't need to look at nature, you don't need any other information, it's all contained right there. And that's how Descartes felt, that's how the medieval followers of Aristotle felt that natural knowledge could also be gained. So for instance, Descartes, who first wrote of the law of conservation of motion, deduced that law from properties of God, from his constancy and his immutability. On the other hand, Bacon felt that that was not the way to discover knowledge of nature. The true method, he said, derives axioms from the senses and particulars. You first start from the evidence in nature and rising by a gradual and unbroken ascent so that it arrives at the most general axioms last of all. And Bacon himself used this method to perform an investigation into heat, by which he concluded that what heat is motion of basically very small, even unobserved parts of matter, which was actually pretty good in these days before they even knew there were molecules. Right? However, as that example, I think, shows, Bacon's idea of inductive reasoning in science was not just very simply gathering all the information you could gather and hoping that something came out of it. It was a much more sophisticated type of use of inductive reasoning. And he pointed to that by saying, those who have handled sciences have been either men of experiment or men of dogmas. The men of experiment are like the ant, they only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders who make cobwebs out of their own substance. So that's Descartes, right? Cobwebs out of their own substance, from their own mind, axioms in their mind. They just sort of draw that out, right? But the bee takes the middle course. It gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and of the field, but transforms it and digests it by a power of its own. And that's what he saw the natural philosopher as being, like the bee, not the ant or the spider. Okay, so that's just a quick little lesson about inductive reasoning and Baconianism. Interestingly, in the 19th century, early in the 19th century, there was a resurgence of deductivism, a resurgence of the view that science could be done purely by deductive reasoning. And that came about in great part, through economics. Right? David Ricardo, a young Jewish stockbroker who picked up Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and decided he wanted to write about political economy. So Ricardo was arguing that economics should be a strict science like mathematics. It should be like geometry, just as Descartes thought science should be. Right? And the problem with that, and you know Ricardo, so I'm just, sorry, take that away. Ricardo is the one who was arguing, and this is still used by many economists today, right? Ricardo is the one who was arguing all economic laws come from universal axioms that are just known self-evidently, like man is a profit maximizer, and you could use that to deduce laws of how people will act in certain circumstances. Right. That all started with Ricardo. And the problem with that, from the point of view of the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club, is that this was sort of trickling down into the natural sciences as well. For instance, Thomas de Quincey, in his best-selling book, Confessions of an Opium Eater, praised Ricardo for somehow bringing order and reason to economic theory, where before there were just all of these messy facts all around. Ricardo ordered everything. He alone had deduced a priori from the understanding itself laws which first gave a ray of light into the unwieldy chaos of materials and had constructed what had been but a collection of tentative discussions into a science of regular proportions, now first standing on an eternal basis. Right? And over at Oxford, Richard Whately and his followers were arguing that all of natural science should be done this way. Right? So to try to bring natural science back to something more like a Baconian inductive method, the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club began to publish books and articles for a general public promoting inductive method. In particular, Jones and Babbage were both writing on economics at the same time, and they were both using the same terminology. Men of science should not be closet philosophers, like what we would maybe call armchair philosophers, right? They have to go out and look and see how the world is before they could come up with laws of economics. And Jones, typically rather abrupt, wrote in the very first pages of his book, Mr. Ricardo produced a system very ingeniously combined of purely hypothetical truths, which, however, a single comprehensive glance at the world as it actually is sufficient to show to be utterly inconsistent with the past and present condition of mankind. So if Ricardo had only gone out and looked at the way people actually do act, he would have seen that his laws made no sense whatsoever. At the same time, Herschel was writing and publishing his preliminary discourse on the study of natural philosophy. So this is the early 30s, in which he puts Bacon right on the frontispiece. Pretty clearly saying this is the way to study natural philosophy. And Herschel's book became so popular, it was known as the book about scientific method. And historians looking back have often said to be a natural philosopher in this time period meant to be like Herschel, right? And in fact, Darwin, who read this book when he was in his last months at Cambridge, right when it came out, later said, "Scarcely anything in my life made so deep an impression on me, it made me wish to try to add my mite to the accumulated store of natural knowledge." Right? And at the same time, Whewell was writing many, many, many things, including multi-volume works, History of the Inductive Sciences, Philosophy of the Inductive Sciences, and in these multi-volume works was hitting home again and again and again how science should be done inductively. You have to use your observations, you have to start from facts and build your science up, not deduce it out of you like the spider pulls his web out. And Whewell's books, he was a Cambridge Don. His books were on the reading lists for anyone who wanted to get the honors degree. So a generation, several generations in fact, of natural philosophers and then scientists who were trained at Cambridge were reading Whewell's books. Right. So they were all pushing this inductive, empirical-based scientific method that Bacon had talked about. They were also encouraging people to think of science as being somehow for the good of the public, which Bacon had said, and that was quite different from earlier medieval views of natural knowledge, which saw it as natural knowledge as something that would either be good for a king so that he could control people or the seas, or sort of good for a small private club of alchemists, who could share their knowledge only amongst themselves. Bacon, however, said science should be for the relief of man's estate. Knowledge may not be as a courtesan for pleasure and vanity only, but as a spouse for generation, fruit, and comfort. He did like to turn a phrase, Bacon. That's one reason why the four members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club turned their attention to economics first. One reason was to counter this Ricardian idea of deductive method in science. The other was because they felt that the economic theory that Ricardo was promoting had really negative and even dangerous consequences for society at that time. This was a period where there were so many people who were poor, who were starving. The pauper problem was one of the big issues of the day. What shall we do with people? many were correctly interpreting Ricardo's position as leading to the view that you should just throw people into workhouses from which they could never escape, and our members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club disagreed. It also didn't hurt them that they gained an immediate large audience for their writings if they started out writing about economics, because everybody was reading and talking about economics at the time. They also felt they were promoting the public good by pushing for funding and pushing for the building of Babbage's engines. I wish I had more time to really talk about these engines. That's a different talk. Babbage invented 2 versions of the difference engine. This is a piece of the first difference engine that was built in his time. This was actually his personal copy. This difference engine number 2 was only built in the 1990s from his plans. The difference engine was, in both versions, a general purpose calculating machine. He later designed an analytical engine which had all the properties really of a modern day computer, except that it was mechanical, would have been mechanical had it been built, rather than electronic. But these friends of Babbage were arguing that his engines would improve navigation, engineering, construction, banking, insurance, and for that reason should be built. And the reason that these machines would have helped in all of those areas is that at the time, there were all of these books that were tables with all the kind of data, statistics, numbers that now we could pull out a pocket calculator and figure out if we needed to know taxation rates, interest rates, mortgage rates, something. This all had to be in books because there were no pocket calculators and nobody could sit around for an hour to get a number, right? So they were published in books. They were calculated by computers. That's what the people who were called, who sat and did these calculations, just like typewriters in the early days of typewriters were the people who would type things. The computers would calculate. They were usually clergymen, school teachers, surveyors. Often they were women. They were working part-time, using a fixed procedure over and over and over again to get these tables of figures. For instance, the nautical almanac that every captain on a ship would have to help determine longitude by the position of the moon in the sky. They needed They needed the lunar differences for that particular time, and each month required 1,365 calculations using logarithms applied to numbers in base 60. Right? So, I mean, you could just imagine how many calculations that is and how hard it is, and why the tables were riddled with error. I mean, just so many ways error could creep in the calculation, in the transferring of numbers from the sheet to a table, in the proofreading section, in the typesetting part, right? And their sort of friend, Dionysius Lardner, once just looked at a sample of 40 tables and found 3,700 acknowledged errata, that they had put slips in the front of books when they found mistakes, and even errata of errata, I mean, just to show you. And Herschel tried to make this point when they were trying to encourage the building of the Babbage engines. An undetected error in a logarithmic table is like, I mean, it's almost very literally like a sunken rock at sea yet undiscovered, upon which it is impossible to say what wrecks may have taken place. Because if you calculated your longitude wrong, who knows, how lost at sea you would be and for how long, right? However, one reason why the engines were never fully built in Babbage's time is that politicians doubted the usefulness of these engines. But not only politicians, even men of science doubted it. For instance, Charles Biddle Airy, the astronomer royal, said, "I think it's likely Babbage lives in a sort of dream as to the engine's utility." Right? To which Babbage, in his usual irascible way, responded, "Propose to an Englishman any instrument, however admirable, and you will observe that the whole effort of the English mind is directed to find a difficulty, defect, or an impossibility in it. If you speak to him of a machine for peeling a potato, he will pronounce it impossible. If you peel a potato with it before his very eyes, he will declare it useless because it will not slice a pineapple." I mean, he did have reason to be irascible, but I think it was also natural. Bacon also had proposed new scientific societies as a way to bring about a revolution in science. In his book, New Atlantis, he depicted an ideal scientific society called Solomon's House. So New Atlantis is his version of the travelogue books that were very popular in his time. Only for Bacon, his book depicts sort of Western European savages who are lost at sea, who come upon a land unbeknown to the West. But the people in this land are the really civilized ones. And part of their civilization is that they have this sort of house for men of science, for natural philosophers, called Solomon's House. Everybody in there has some role to play in gaining or using or promulgating scientific knowledge. It's funded by the king of the island, and so these men have science as their career. This is an etching from an early edition of the book, I think even from when, I think even from the 17th century. I guess this is the house. I don't know, these men seem suspiciously like they're inventing the childhood game of stringing string between two cups to see if you can hear. They must be doing something else, though. I don't know. The Royal Society of London, when it was founded in 1660, was explicitly meant to be a scientific society like Solomon's House. Only by the 19th century, it was really no longer fulfilling that purpose. With his habitual interest in numbers and statistics, Babbage had calculated that only about 10% of the members, the fellows of the Royal Society in his time, had actually published any real scientific work in the transactions of the Royal Society. Most of the people at this point in the 19th century who belonged to the Royal Society as fellows were antiquarians or, noblemen who liked to have the soirees with the natural philosophers. They were not actively working in science themselves. So the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club felt that it was important to have scientific societies that were only open to practicing members of the profession of science. And so they were involved in forming a number of these. And what these societies did was limit membership to people really working in science. They brought back an old tradition of having discussion of papers, a Q&A, after papers were presented. At the Royal Society at this time, that was not allowed. It was felt to be ungentlemanly. So keep that in mind during our Q&A. It was ungentlemanly to question anybody. The British Association brought back that tradition of really, having questions and answers so that other practitioners of science could push you a little bit and see what your results really meant. And another very important result of the societies that the Philosophical Breakfast Club was involved in organizing was that it gave women a foot in the door of science. Because at this time, women were not allowed to be members of societies. The British Association, though, was a roving society, so it was held in the provinces. It wasn't located only in London, and members would have to travel to wherever the meeting was. And they were encouraged to bring their wives, their sisters, their daughters, and the women were allowed to attend the public lectures that were held in the evening, the all-important conversazione, as they were called, where there would be promenading and ices and champagne and discussion of what had gone on during the day. And little by little by little, they started attending the regular session meetings. And the organizers of the British Association would talk about this, and their concern was, is there room in these meeting halls for all these women who want to come in? But they didn't stop it. And it was really a way that women got a foot in the door of science as it was actually practiced. And in fact, when the British Association allowed women as members of the association, it was decades, even more than decades, before the Royal Society would have fellows who were women. The last aspect that I'm going to talk about today of the Baconian revolution that the Philosophical Breakfast Club helped bring about in the 19th century was the idea that there should be public funding for science. We saw that in the Solomon's house, the idea was the king was paying for all the research that was going on there. In the early 19th century, there was no real public funding. The Royal Academy in France did pay stipends to the few people who were members there, but there were many strings attached. Basically, you had to be doing the kind of research that the Royal Academy felt was important, and even to the point where when you were required to attend all the meetings, and your seat was determined by your seniority. So it was not really free public funding. It came with many strings, right? So for instance, in England, James Watt spent all of his own money to develop and build a steam engine. Occasionally there were prizes like the Longitude Prize people have heard about. There's the Harrison chronometer that was built in response to that call to figure out a way to determine longitude at sea without needing the nautical almanac anymore. But there weren't grants, and prizes were good, but you would have to do the work hoping to win the prize, right? You weren't being funded while you were doing the work, and if you didn't win the prize, then basically you had spent all that time for nothing. But the British Association initiated the idea of giving grants in advance for scientific work. They used the membership dues. They had made a lot of money on the ladies' tickets for attending the public lectures. Whewell got a lot of these grants, but so did many other members of the British Association. And soon afterwards, the Royal Society of London and the French Academy of Science sort of followed suit and began giving grants for research to men of science. Babbage was really in the vanguard as well, although he inherited over £100,000 in those days from his father when his father died. Babbage felt really strongly that he should not be spending his own money to build his engines. Herschel and Whewell were constantly writing letters and lobbying people to get money for Babbage's engines, and he did get a lot of funding for the government. In the end, he had received the equivalent of like $2.5 million to build the engines, which then never were, in fact, built anyway. And in that time, that was more than double the cost of an Admiralty warship, like that one. They also were lobbying for the government to pay for an expedition to find the magnetic South Pole. And so in a diary entry, Herschel writes, "Dined today with the Queen at Windsor Castle, where had much conversation with Lord Melbourne about the projected South Polar expedition." And in the end, with the lobbying of Herschel and Whewell and others, the government did fund that expedition. So, the scientist. The members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club devoted their lives to bringing about their college dream. And what I find, what I find so remarkable about that is that they really did succeed. They wanted to bring about a Bacon-influenced revolution in science. They did. In many ways, not only these four, by the end of their lives, the scientist was a professional who belonged to certain groups, who read certain journals, who published in those journals, who followed a certain method, who could get funding, who could have a career and make a living as a scientist. So in that sense, they and the people around them were involved with the invention brought about the modern day scientist. Just in conclusion now, I would like to point out, that's the heroic part of the story. They did, in a sense, invent the modern scientist. However, there's also a kind of a flip side to that, an irony, if you will, which is they were amateurs and generalists. I mean, they were natural philosophers. And there are some aspects of this revolution they wrought that they would not have been completely pleased with. Incidentally, these are images of the three who were still living in the 1860s and 1870s, and they're all towards the end of their lives in these Actually, these are all photographs. What wouldn't they have been happy about? The over-specialization, for one thing. Only 10 years after Whewell died, one of his students, James Clerk Maxwell, in a review of an early sort of life and letters collection of Whewell that had been published, wrote, "We frequently hear the complaint that as the boundaries of science are widened, its cultivators become less of philosophers and more of specialists, each confining himself with increasing exclusiveness to the area with which he is familiar." That's, of course, continued into the modern day. You don't have people like Herschel or Whewell anymore, who could, like Herschel, do chemical experiments in the daytime, then when the stars came out, go to his telescope and make astronomical observations, who could, do math problems to help figure out how the difference engine should calculate, and then on vacation take a geological hammer and look for fossils. It's very hard to find people like that anymore. The other result of the modern scientist, the invention of the modern scientist, that the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club would have bemoaned, I think, quite a bit, this disjunction between science and the rest of culture. C.P. Snow, in his famous lecture on the two cultures, which was given in the very same Senate House room where Whewell invented the word scientist, said, "The intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes even hostility and dislike." These men straddled both cultures. They were scientists and artists. Whewell and Herschel both wrote poetry. They both translated the German Romantic poets. They had a sense of wonder in nature. They approached the natural world not just as scientists, but as artists. And Whewell really expresses this so beautifully in a letter to Jones before he goes off to the Lake District to do some geologizing. And he says, "You have no idea of the variety of different uses to which I shall turn a mountain. After perhaps sketching it from the bottom, I shall climb to the top and measure its height by the barometer, knock off a piece of rock with a geological hammer to see what it is made of, and then evolve some quotation from Wordsworth into the still air above it." They had a sense of wonder in nature, which they also were able to give to the general public, to really transmit to others. And that's why Darwin later in life said, "I think sometimes that general and popular treatises are almost as important for the progress of science as original work." I mean, Origin of Species itself is a book that was written for the general public. That's why it's written the way it is. That's why he starts with breeding, right? Variation under domestication, because he knows everybody in the culture has some relationship to breeding, either because they grew up on a farm, they have relatives on a farm, they live in London and breed pigeons, they have a country estate where they breed hunting dogs, right? So what these men all did so beautifully was not just make discoveries, but then bring them to a public in a way that the public could understand and appreciate the importance of doing that. And in fact, not only were they writing books and articles for the general public, they were engaging the public and showing them, you too can do scientific work. Whewell was published a book on how to make tidal observations, right? And he would invite people to mail in to him their results. At the same time, Babbage was publishing a form that you could use when touring a factory. In his book on factory manufacturing, there's a form on questions to ask when you're touring a factory, so you could have all the data that you need to make conclusions about the importance of factory manufacturing for economic theory. And Herschel, at the very same moment, was talking about skeleton forms that a scientist or a member of the public could take with him or her when you go to the seaside, go to the mountaintop, to record your observations. Today, I fear these men would have been very sad to look out and find such a disjunction between the two cultures. This is a little bit different. Today we have a situation where, at best, 28% of the American public can be considered scientifically literate. That is tested by asking questions like, did humans and dinosaurs live at the same time? What approximate proportion of the Earth is covered in water? Not very hard questions. Just as we're being asked to weigh in as citizens, as voters, on fairly complex scientific topics. So what can scientists do? I'm luckily out of time, so I can't really go into a very long discussion about that. But I would just like to leave you with the thought that possibly scientists today couldn't go very wrong by taking a little bit of inspiration from the 19th century natural philosopher, ironically from the very people who invented the modern scientist. Thank you. Okay, sure. Questions, comments? Yes?
Can you think of any other group that were like this group that might have made a similar contribution?
In this time period?
Or any time period?
Well, the question was, are there other groups of people who have made similar contributions? Yes, there are many other periods where you could find groups of people who had important impact on culture. In terms of science, yes, you could look at the 18th century. I mean, Jenny Uglaw wrote Lunar Men. That's a lovely look at a group of men in that period who were industrialists, who were changing science in different ways. Even in this period, in the 19th century, of course, there were other people who were involved in making this change to the modern scientist. I don't mean to suggest that it was only these four. It was the people who were all around them. As well. But what's so interesting about these four is, they met, they very explicitly decided they wanted to make a change in the way science was done. They stayed friends and in correspondence with each other about that project for 60 years. And then by the end of their lives, that change had happened. And over the course of the 60 years, they had so much to do with that change. So in a sense, I picked them out because they did have a lot to do with that change, but also because their lives track that change so wonderfully. Yes?
So I was wondering, and this may be an unfair question, in terms of professionalization or specialization, there are clear examples of it, and they work together in this way, and it was true. I'm wondering if in other fields it was not equally entrenched or broader social startles.
Yes, and the 19th century does seem to be this moment where there is more and more professionalization going on. What's interesting about this happening in science is that I think it's happening a little bit later by the time it actually happens, and that the change is so great. Really from the science being the province of the amateur completely, to the point where, I should say, and of course I didn't have time for all the nuances in this talk, but many men of science did not want to be called scientists at first. They did not want to give up natural philosopher. They did not want to give up the amateur status because that was seen as somehow being more gentlemanly. And so
although this change happened by the end of the century, some people were dragged kicking and screaming into that professionalized mode. And many people rejected the word scientist for quite some time. In fact, there's this funny moment in the 1860s where I think the president of the Antiquarian Society wrote in a letter that, this word scientist, this barbarous American trisyllable word, because I guess the idea was everything bad and savage comes from the Americans. So even the origins of the word were kind of lost. But yes, the 19th century is sort of an age of professionalization, certainly in England. I think there was, yes. Yes, Ken. Well, they were making contributions to science in this period and certainly before. For example, in the book, when I talk about the origin of photography, which is part of the story I tell there, it was really a woman in the 18th century, a British woman who did early experiments that showed that the sun could act on certain metallic salts and darken or change colors. And that's really, the origin of photography. In the time of these, the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club, there are women, there's Anna Atkins, who's doing important work in classifying algae, and she uses the cyanotype process that Herschel develops to do that, to publish books showing photographs of the algae. Anyway, so there are many cases. Women are making contributions, but they weren't really accepted into the communities of the natural philosophers in the same way. They weren't allowed to join as full members of these societies. I think it was the Botanical Society, the Royal Botanical Society in England, that was the first that allowed women as full members, and that was in the 50s. But of the major sort of generalist societies, the British Association was decades before the Royal Society, almost 100 years before, and then the general societies of other countries were much later.
I got the note that people can't hear the questions, so I just came here to repeat the questions. Okay, I will do that.
Sure, thank you.
Back there, please.
Well, not directly from these people. I mean, there are other societies. In the U.S., there's the Philosophical Society, the American Philosophical Society that, Benjamin Franklin was involved with in Philadelphia. But these men didn't really have a direct influence on science in the provinces. I mean, their works were being read, that is for sure. And Whewell and Herschel's books were very popular in England, and I suspect they were here as well. But I haven't really followed any paths of influence to America.
Yes, back there.
Yes, that's a really good question. Peirce was extremely influenced by Whewell. And I actually kind of came to Whewell through Peirce, in a sense. And what's so interesting about Peirce is that if you read his early manuscripts, there are many references to Whewell. Then, in the published versions of those manuscripts, all the references are taken out. So I think he was very influenced by Whewell's epistemology, which stressed the fact that we kind of see the world through certain ideas in the mind, which Whewell thought you get partly through experience and partly they are just sort of innately in your mind. And Peirce, I think, and his view of, sort of seeing through concepts, I think is directly influenced by Whewell's writings. Yes?
I just want to reassure you that the proportion of scientific illiteracy is going down. I know an American art, and I was in Moran during meetings with the geologists and down in Baconian. I always ask, how old is the Earth? And for many years, none of them knew. And now by fifth grade, they're saying, oh, it's been 4.5 billion years.
Yay!
It's a real change between NOVA and
You know what? There is a lot of positive stuff going on. Absolutely. I do think part of the problem, of course, education is important. I think part of the problem is that at a certain level, kids are turned off of science, or they decide not to become a scientist, and then as adults are not that interested. And I think part of the reason for that is that scientists themselves are not really encouraged to spend time bringing their results and their fields to the public. It doesn't help you get tenure, it doesn't help you get a grant from the NSF, it doesn't help you set up a lab. But I also feel that this disjunction between the two cultures comes partly just from the feeling that, science doesn't have anything to say to me. If I'm not a scientist, it's sort of not impinging in my life, which obviously it is. And I feel more could be done to make that point to people. I'm trying to. I think historians can have a part in that as well.
self-selecting at age 7 and age 9. Passions begin very early.
Yes. Well, that's why, I certainly think education is really key. Absolutely. And, institutions like the Smithsonian that, are bringing in kids and, letting them say, just this room, I want to spend the next 2 hours in this room. It's wonderful, quite wonderful and important.
Any more questions? Well, in that case, we thank you, Laura, again for a wonderful
Thank you. And thank you all.